Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be reading and discussing Burton Watson's translation of chapters 11 and 12 of the Lotus Sutra. Chapter 11 is called Emergence of the Treasure Tower, and chapter 12 is called the Devadatta chapter. Chapter 11 was composed in the third phase of the composition of the Lotus Sutra, which took place in around the 1st century CE, wherein chapters 10 through 22 were composed. The 12th chapter comes from a different portion of the Lotus Sutra than the one we've been reading from so far. It was most likely composed in the fourth and final phase of the composition of the Lotus Sutra, wherein chapters 23 through 27, as well as chapter 12, were composed, with chapter 28 being added to the sutra as an extant text. This period is said to have taken place around the 2nd century CE. Chapter 11 is so named because in it a jeweled stupa emerges from the earth, with another Buddha named Prabhuta sitting inside it. This Buddha is a skeleton, and he invites Shakyamuni to come sit by him and preach with him. In this chapter, we learn that Buddhas do not die after they attain their final nirvana. The Devadatta chapter is so named because of the radical claim that it seems to make. The message of this chapter, as you will see, is that anybody, even the most evil person in all of Buddhism, Devadatta, can and will become a Buddha as a result of yoking themselves to the Lotus Sutra teaching. If you remember, Devadatta is the Buddha's cousin, and is known for having committed several of the 5 most grievous sins, which are killing one's mother, killing one's father, killing an arhat, wounding a Tathagata, and creating a schism in the Sangha. All in all, these chapters upturn 7 centuries of doctrinal precedent, while at the same time calling into question all of Buddhist morality up to that point. Also, it wouldn't be a Mahayana text if Sariputra didn't get absolutely destroyed for having incorrect views on women, so look forward to that as well. We hope you enjoy. At that time, in the Buddha's presence, there was a tower adorned with the 7 treasures, 500 yojanas in height and 250 yojanas in width and depth, that rose up out of the earth and stood suspended in the air. Various kinds of precious objects adorned it. It had 5,000 railings, 1,000, 10,000 rooms, and numberless streamers and banners decorated it. Festoons of jewels hung down, and 10,000 million jeweled bells were suspended from it. All 4 sides emitted a fragrance of tamalapatra and sandalwood that pervaded the whole world. Its banners and canopies were made of the 7 treasures, namely gold, silver, lapis lazuli, seashell, agate, pearl, and carnelian, and it was so high it reached the heavenly palaces of the 4 heavenly kings. The gods of the Triyatrimsa heaven rained down heavenly mandarava flowers as an offering to the treasure tower, and the other heavenly beings, and the dragons, yakshas, gandharvas, asuras, garudas, kimnaras, maharagas, human and non-human beings, an assembly of thousands, 10,000s, millions, offered all kinds of flowers, incense, necklaces, streamers, canopies, and music as alms to the treasure tower, paying it reverence, honor, and praise. At that time, a loud voice issued from the treasure tower, speaking words of praise. Excellent, excellent Shakyamuni, world-honored one, that you can take the great wisdom of equality, a law to instruct the bodhisattvas, guarded and kept in mind by the Buddhas, the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law, and preach it for the sake of the great assembly. It is as you say, Shakyamuni, world-honored one, all that you have expounded is the truth. At that time, the 4 kinds of believers saw the great treasure tower suspended in the air, and they heard the voice that issued from the tower. All experienced the joy of the law, marveling at this thing they had never known before. They rose from their seats, pressed their palms together in reverence, and then retired to one side. At that time there was a bodhisattva and mahasattva named Great Joy of Preaching, who understood the doubts that were in the minds of the heavenly and human beings, asuras, and other beings of all the world. He said to the Buddha, "World-honored one, for what reason has this treasure tower risen up out of the earth, and why does this voice issue from its midst?" At that time the Buddha said, "Bodhisattva, Great Joy of Preaching, in the treasure tower is the complete body of a thus come one. Long ago, an immeasurable 1,000, 10,000 million asamkhyas of worlds to the east, in a land called Treasure Purity, there was a Buddha named Many Treasures. When this Buddha was originally carrying out the Bodhisattva way, he made a great vow, saying, 'If, after I have become a Buddha and entered extinction, in the lands in the 10 directions there is any place where the Lotus Sutra is preached, then my funerary tower, in order that I may listen to the sutra, will come forth and appear in that spot to testify to the sutra and praise its excellence.' When that Buddha had finished carrying out the Buddha way and was on the point of passing into extinction, in the midst of the great assembly of heavenly and human beings, he said to the monks, "After I have passed into extinction, if there are those who wish to offer alms to complete my body, then they should erect a great tower." That Buddha, through his transcendental powers and the power of his vow, ensures that, throughout the worlds in the 10 directions, no matter in what place, if there are those who preach the Lotus Sutra, this treasure tower will in all cases come forth and appear in their presence, and his complete body will be in the tower, speaking words of praise and saying, "Excellent, excellent." Great joy of preaching. Now this tower of the thus come one many treasures, because it heard the preaching of the Lotus Sutra, has come forth out of the ground and speaks words of praise, saying, "Excellent, excellent." At this time, Bodhisattva Great Joy of Preaching, knowing the supernatural powers of the thus come one, spoke to the Buddha, saying, "World-honored one, we wish to see the body of this Buddha." The Buddha said to the Bodhisattva and Mahasattva Great Joy of Preaching, "This many treasures Buddha has taken a profound vow, saying, when my treasure tower, in order to listen to the Lotus Sutra, comes forth into the presence of one of the Buddhas, if there should be those who wish me to show my body to the 4 kinds of believers, then let the various Buddhas who are emanations of that Buddha and who are preaching the law in the worlds in the 10 directions all return and gather around that Buddha in a single spot. Only when that has been done will my body become visible. Great Joy of Preaching, I will now gather together the various Buddhas that are emanations of my body and that are preaching the law in the worlds in the 10 directions." Great Joy of Preaching said to the Buddha, "World-honored one, I and the others also wish to see these Buddhas that are emanations of the World-honored one, and to make obeisance to them and to offer alms." At that time, the Buddha emitted a ray of light emitting from the tuft of white hair between his eyebrows, immediately making visible the Buddhas in the eastern region in lands as numerous as 510,000 million Nayutas of Ganges sands. The earth in all of these lands was made of crystal, and the lands were adorned with jeweled trees and jeweled robes. Countless thousands, 10,000s, millions of bodhisattvas filled them, and everywhere were hung jeweled curtains with jeweled nets covering them over. The Buddhas in these lands preached the various doctrines of the law with great and wonderful voices, and one could see immeasurable thousands, 10,000s, millions of bodhisattvas filling all these lands and preaching the law for the assembly. In the southern, western, and northern regions as well, and in the 4 intermediate quarters and up and down, wherever the beam from the tuft of white hair, a characteristic feature of the Buddha, shone, the same was true. At that time, the Buddhas of the 10 directions each spoke to his multitude of bodhisattvas, saying, "Good men, now I must go to the Saha world, to the place where Shakyamuni Buddha is, and also offer alms to the treasure tower of many treasures thus come one." The Saha world thereupon immediately changed into a place of cleanness and purity. The ground was made of lapis lazuli, jeweled trees adorned it, and ropes of gold marked off the 8 highways. There were no villages, towns or cities, great seas or rivers, mountains, streams or forests. Great jeweled incense was burning there, and mandarava flowers covered the ground all over. Jeweled nets and curtains were spread above, hung with jeweled bells, and the members of this assembly alone were gathered there, all other heavenly and human beings having been moved to another region. At that time the Buddhas, each with a great bodhisattva to act as his attendant, arrived in the Saha world and proceeded to a position beneath one of the jeweled trees. Each of these jeweled trees was 500 yojanas high and adorned with branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit in due proportion. Under all the jeweled trees were lion seats, 5 yojanas in height, and these too were decorated with large jewels. At that time, each of the Buddhas took one of these seats, seating himself in cross-legged position. In this way, the seats were filled throughout the 1,000,000,000-fold world. But still, there was no end even to the emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha arriving from merely one direction. At that time, Shakyamuni Buddha, wishing to provide space for all the Buddhas that were emanations of his body, in addition transformed 210,000 million Nayutas of lands in each of the 8 directions, making them all clean and pure and without hells, hungry spirits, beasts, or asuras. He moved all their heavenly and human beings to another region. The ground in these lands that he had transformed was also made of lapis lazuli. Jeweled trees adorned them, each tree 500 yojanas high and adorned with branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit in due proportion. There were jeweled lion seats under all the trees, 5 yojanas in height and ornamented with various kinds of treasures. These lands too were without great seas or rivers, or any kingly ranges of mountains such as the Muchilinda Mountains, the Mahamuchilinda Mountains, Iron Encircling Mountains, Great Iron Encircling Mountains, or Mount Sumeru. The whole area comprised a single Buddha land, a jeweled region level and smooth. Curtains crisscrossed with festoons of jewels were spread everywhere. Banners and canopies hung down. Great jeweled incense burned, and heavenly jeweled flowers covered the ground all around. Shakyamuni Buddha, in order to provide seats for all the Buddhas that were arriving, once more transformed 210,000 million nayutas of lands in each of the 8 directions, making them all clean and pure and without hells, hungry spirits, beasts, or asuras. He also moved all the heavenly and human beings to another region. The ground in these lands that he had transformed was likewise made of lapis lazuli. Jeweled trees adorned the lands, each tree 500 yojanas in height and adorned with branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit in due proportion. There were jeweled lion seats under all the trees, 5 yojanas in height and ornamented with great jewels. These lands too were without seas or rivers, or any kingly ranges such as the Mochilinda Mountains, Mahamochilinda Mountains, Iron Encircling Mountains, Great Iron Encircling Mountains, or Mount Sumeru, the whole area comprising a single Buddha land, a jeweled region level and smooth. Curtains crisscrossed with festoons of jewels were spread everywhere. Banners and canopies hung down. Great jeweled incense burned, and heavenly jeweled flowers covered the ground all around. At that time, the emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha from the eastern region, Buddhas in lands equal in number to hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, millions of Nayutas of Ganges sands, each preaching the law, had assembled there. And bit by bit the Buddhas from the 10 directions all came and assembled in this way, and were seated in the 8 directions. At this time, each of the directions was filled with Buddhas, thus come ones, and 410,000 million Nayutas of lands. At this time, the Buddhas, each seated on a lion seat under one of the jeweled trees, all dispatched their attendants to go and greet Shakyamuni Buddha. Each Buddha presented his attendant with a handful of jeweled flowers and said, "Good man, you must go to Mount Gridrakuta, to the place where Shakyamuni Buddha is, and speak to him as I instruct you. Say, are your illnesses few? Are your worries few? In spirit and vigor are you well and happy? And are the bodhisattvas and voice hearers all well and at peace? Then take these jeweled flowers and scatter them over the Buddha as an offering, and say, the Buddha so-and-so would like to participate in the opening of this treasure tower." All the Buddhas dispatched their attendants to speak in this manner. At that time, Shakyamuni Buddha saw the Buddhas that were his emanations all assembled, each sitting on a lion's seat, and heard all these Buddhas say that they wished to participate in the opening of the treasure tower. Immediately he rose from his seat and stationed himself in midair. All the 4 kinds of believers likewise stood up, pressed their palms together, and gazed at the Buddha with a single mind. Shakyamuni Buddha, with the fingers of his right hand, then opened the door of the Tower of 7 Treasures. A loud sound issued from it, like the sound of a lock and crossbar being removed from a great city gate, and at once all the members of the assembly caught sight of many treasures thus come one, seated on a lion seat inside the treasure tower, his body whole and unimpaired, sitting as though engaged in meditation. And they heard him say, "Excellent, excellent Shakyamuni Buddha, you have preached this Lotus Sutra in a spirited manner. I have come here in order that I may hear this sutra." At that time, the 4 kinds of believers, observing this Buddha, who had passed into extinction immeasurable thousands, 10,000s, millions of kalpas in the past, speaking in this way, marveled at what they had never known before, and took the masses of heavenly jeweled flowers and scattered them over Many Treasures Buddha and Shakyamuni Buddha. At that time, Many Treasures Buddha offered half of his seat in the treasure tower to Shakyamuni Buddha, saying, "Shakyamuni Buddha, sit here." Shakyamuni Buddha at once entered the tower and took half of the seat, seating himself in cross-legged position. At that time, the members of the great assembly, seeing the 2 thus come ones seated cross-legged on the lion seat in the Tower of 7 Treasures, all thought to themselves, "These Buddhas are seated high up and far away. If only the thus come ones would employ their transcendental powers to enable all of us to join them there in the air." Immediately, Shakyamuni Buddha used his transcendental powers to lift all the members of the great assembly up into the air. And in a loud voice he addressed all the 4 kinds of believers, saying, "Who is capable of broadly preaching the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law in this Saha world? Now is the time to do so, for before long the thus come one will enter nirvana. The Buddha wishes to entrust this Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law to someone so that it may be preserved." At that time, the world-honored one, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, "This holy Lord, this world-honored one, though he passed into extinction long ago, still seats himself in the treasure tower, coming here for the sake of the law. You people, why then do you also not strive for the sake of the law? This Buddha passed into extinction an endless number of kalpas ago, but in many places he comes to listen to the law because such opportunities are hard to encounter. This Buddha originally made a vow, saying, After I have passed into extinction, wherever I may go, in whatever place, my constant aim will be to hear the law. In addition, these emanations of my body, Buddhas in immeasurable numbers like Ganges sands, have come desiring to hear the law, and so they may see many treasures thus come one who has passed into extinction. Each has abandoned his wonderful land, as well as his host of disciples, the heavenly and human beings, dragons and spirits, and all the offerings they give him, and has come to this place on purpose to make certain the law will long endure. In order to seat these Buddhas, I have employed transcendental powers, moving immeasurable multitudes, causing lands to be clean and pure, leading each of these Buddhas to the foot of a jeweled tree, adorned as lotus blossoms, adorn a clear, cool pond. Beneath these jeweled trees are lion seats, and the Buddhas seat themselves on them, adorning them with their brilliance, like a huge torch burning in the darkness of the night. A wonderful incense exudes from their bodies, pervading the lands in the 10 directions. Living beings are wrapped in the aroma, unable to restrain their joy, as though a great wind were tossing the branches of small trees. Through this expedient means, they make certain that the law will long endure. So I say to the great assembly, after I have passed into extinction, who can guard and uphold, read and recite this sutra? Now, in the presence of the Buddha, let him come forward and speak his vow. This many treasures Buddha, though he passed into extinction long ago, because of his great vow, roars the lion's roar. Many treasures thus come one, I myself, and these emanation Buddhas who have gathered here, surely know this is our aim. You sons of the Buddha, who can guard the law, let him make a great vow to ensure that it will long endure. He who is capable of guarding the law of this sutra will thereby have offered alms to me and to many treasures. This many treasures Buddha dwelling in this treasure tower journeys constantly throughout the 10 directions for the sake of this sutra. One who guards this sutra will have also offered alms to the emanation Buddhas who have come here adorning and making brilliant all the various worlds. If one preaches this sutra, he will be able to see me, and many treasures thus come one, and these emanation Buddhas. All you good men, each of you must consider carefully. This is a difficult matter. It is proper you should make a great vow. The other sutras number as many as Ganges sands, but though you expound those sutras, that is not worth regarding as difficult. If you were to seize Mount Sumeru and fling it far off to the measureless Buddha lands, that too would not be difficult. If you used the toe of your foot to move the 1,000,000,000-fold world, booting it far away to other lands, that too would not be difficult. If you stood in the summit of being, heaven, and for the sake of the assembly preached countless other sutras, that too would not be difficult. But if after the Buddha has entered extinction, in the time of evil, you can preach this sutra, that will be difficult indeed. If there were a person who took the empty sky in his hand and walked all around with it, that would not be difficult. But if after I have passed into extinction, one can write out and embrace this sutra and cause others to write it out, that will be difficult indeed. If one took the great earth, placed it on his toenail, and ascended with it to the Brahma heaven, that would not be difficult. But if after the Buddha has passed into extinction, in the time of evil, one can even for a little while read this sutra, that will be difficult indeed. If when the fires come at the end of the kalpa, one can load dry grass on his back and enter the fire without being burned, that would not be difficult. But after I have passed into extinction, if one can embrace this sutra and expound it to even one person, that will be difficult indeed. If one were to embrace this storehouse of 84,000 doctrines, the 12 divisions of the sutras, and expound it to others, causing listeners to acquire the 6 transcendental powers, though one could do that, that would not be difficult. But after I have entered extinction, if one can listen to and accept this sutra, and ask about its meaning, that would be difficult indeed. If a person expounds the law, allowing thousands, 10,000s, millions, immeasurable numbers of living beings equal to Ganges sands to become arhats endowed with the 6 transcendental powers, though one might confer such benefits, that would not be difficult. But after I have entered extinction, if one can honor and embrace a sutra such as this one, that would be difficult indeed. For the sake of the Buddha way, in immeasurable numbers of lands, from the beginning until now, I have widely preached many sutras, and among them this sutra is foremost. If one can uphold this, he will be upholding the Buddha's body. All you good men, after I have entered extinction, who can accept and uphold, read and recite this sutra? Now in the presence of the Buddha, let him come forward and speak his vow. This sutra is hard to uphold. If one can uphold it even for a short while, I will surely rejoice, and so will the other Buddhas. A person who can do this wins the admiration of the Buddhas. This is what is meant by valor. This is what is meant by diligence. This is what is called observing the precepts and practicing dutta. This way, one will quickly attain the unsurpassed Buddha way. And if in future existences one can read and uphold this sutra, he will be a true son of the Buddha, dwelling in a land spotless and good. If after the Buddha has passed into extinction, one can understand the meaning of this sutra, he will be the eyes of the world, for heavenly and human beings. If in that fearful age one can preach this sutra for even a moment, he will deserve to receive alms from all heavenly and human beings. At that time, the Buddha addressed the bodhisattvas, the heavenly and human beings, and the four kinds of believers, saying, "Immeasurable kalpas in the past, I sought the Lotus Sutra without ever flagging. During those many kalpas, I constantly appeared as the ruler of a kingdom who made a vow to seek the unsurpassed Bodhi. His mind never wavered or turned aside, and in his desire to fulfill the 6 paramitas, he diligently distributed alms, never stinting in heart, whether the gift was elephants or horses, the 7 rare articles, countries, cities, wife, children, maidservants, menservants, or his own head, eyes, marrow, and brain, his own flesh and limbs. He did not begrudge even his own being and life. At that period, the human lifespan was immeasurably long. But for the sake of the law, this king abandoned his kingdom and throne, delegated the government to the crown prince, sounded drums and sent out proclamations, seeking the law in 4 directions, and saying, 'Who can expound the great vehicle for me? To the end of my life I will be his provider and servant.' At that time there was a seer who came to the king and said, 'I have a great vehicle text called the Sutra of the Lotus of the Wonderful Law. If you will never disobey me, I will expound it for you.' When the king heard these words of the seer, he danced for joy. At once he accompanied the seer, providing him with whatever he needed, picking fruit, drawing water, gathering firewood, setting out meals, even offering his own body as a couch and seat, never stinting in body or mind. He served the seer in this manner for 1,000 years, all for the sake of the law, working diligently, acting as a provider, and seeing to it that the seer lacked for nothing. At that time the world-honored one, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, 'I recall those departed kalpas of the past, when in order to seek the great law, though I was the ruler of a worldly kingdom, I was not greedy to satisfy the 5 desires, but instead struck the bell, crying in 4 quarters, "Who possesses the great law? If you will explain and preach it for me, I will be his slave and servant." At that time there was a seer named Asita, who came and announced to this great king, "I have a subtle and wonderful law, rarely known in this world. If you will undertake religious practice, I will expound it for you." When the king heard the seer's words, his heart was filled with great joy. Immediately he accompanied the seer, providing him with whatever he needed, gathering firewood, fruit and wild rice, presenting them at appropriate times with respect and reverence. Because the wonderful law was in his thoughts, he never flagged in body or mind. For the sake of living beings everywhere, he diligently sought the great law, taking no heed for himself, or for the gratification of the 5 desires. Therefore, the ruler of a great kingdom, through diligent seeking, was able to acquire this law, and eventually to attain Buddhahood, as I will now explain to you. The king at that time was I myself, and the seer was the man who is now Devadatta. All because Devadatta was a good friend to me, I was able to become fully endowed with the 6 paramitas, with pity, compassion, joy, and indifference, with the 32 features, the 80 characteristics, the purple-tinged golden color, the 10 powers, the 4 kinds of fearlessness, the 4 methods of winning people, the 18 unshared properties, and the transcendental powers, and the power of the way. The fact that I have attained impartial and correct enlightenment, and can save living beings on a broad scale, is all due to Devadatta, who is a good friend. Then the Buddha said to the 4 kinds of believers, Devadatta, after immeasurable kalpas have passed, will attain Buddhahood. He will be called Heavenly King Thus Come One, worthy of offerings, of right and universal knowledge, perfect clarity in conduct, well gone, understanding the world, unexcelled worthy, trainer of people, teacher of heavenly and human beings, Buddha, world-honored one. His world will be called Heavenly Way, and at that time Heavenly King Buddha will abide in the world for 20 medium kalpas, broadly preaching the wonderful law for the sake of living beings. Living beings numerous as Ganges sands will attain the fruit of arhatship. Immeasurable numbers of living beings will conceive the desire to become Pratyekabuddhas. Living beings as numerous as Ganges sands will conceive a desire for the unsurpassed way, will gain the truth of birthlessness, and will never regress. After Heavenly King Buddha enters parinirvana, his correct law will endure in the world for 20 medium kalpas. The relics from his whole body will be housed in a tower built of the 7 treasures, 60 yojanas in height and 40 yojanas in width and depth. All the heavenly and human beings will take assorted flowers, powdered incense, incense for burning, paste incense, clothing, necklaces, streamers and banners, jeweled canopies, music and songs for praise, and offer them with obeisance to the wonderful seven-jeweled tower. Immeasurable numbers of living beings will attain the fruits of arhatship. Numberless living beings will become enlightened as Pratyeka-Buddhas, and unimaginable numbers of living beings will conceive a desire for Bodhi and will reach the level of no regression. The Buddha said to the monks, "In future ages, if there are good men or good women who, on hearing the Devadatta chapter of the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law, believe and revere it with pure hearts and harbor no doubts or perplexities, they will never fall into hell or the realm of hungry spirits or of beasts, but will be born in the presence of the Buddhas of the 10 directions, and in the place where they are born they will constantly hear this sutra. If they're born among human or heavenly beings, they will enjoy exceedingly wonderful delights, and if they are born in the presence of a Buddha, they will be born by transformation from lotus flowers." At that time, there was a bodhisattva who was among the followers of many treasures world-honored one, from the lower region, and whose name was Wisdom Accumulated. He said to many treasures Buddha, "Shall we return to our homeland?" Shakyamuni Buddha said to Wisdom Accumulated, "Good man, wait a little while. There is a bodhisattva named Manjushri here whom you should see. Debate and discuss the wonderful law with him, and then you may return to your homeland." At that time, Manjushri was seated on a 1,000-petaled lotus blossom big as a carriage wheel, and the bodhisattvas who had come with him were also seated on jeweled lotus blossoms. Manjushri had emerged in a natural manner from the palace of the Dragon King Sagara in the great ocean and was suspended in the air. Proceeding to Holy Eagle Peak, he descended from the lotus blossom and, having entered the presence of the Buddhas, bowed his head and paid obeisance to the feet of the 2 world-honored ones. When he had concluded these gestures of respect, he went to where Wisdom Accumulated was and exchanged greetings with him, and then retired and sat on one side. Bodhisattva Wisdom Accumulated questioned Manjushri, saying, "When you went to the palace of the Dragon King, how many living beings did you convert?" Manjushri replied, "The number is immeasurable, incapable of calculation. The mouth cannot express it. The mind cannot fathom it. Wait a moment, and there will be proof." Before he had finished speaking, countless bodhisattvas seated on jeweled lotus blossoms emerged from the ocean and proceeded to Holy Eagle Peak, where they remained suspended in the air. These bodhisattvas had all been converted and saved by Manjushri. They had carried out all the bodhisattva practices and all discussed and expounded the 6 paramitas with one another. Those who had originally been voice-hearers expounded the practices of the voice-hearer when they were in the air, but now they were all practicing the great vehicle principle of emptiness. Manjushri said to Wisdom Accumulated, "The work of teaching and converting carried out in the ocean was as you can see." At that time, Bodhisattva Wisdom Accumulated recited these verses of praise. "Of great wisdom and virtue, brave and stalwart, you have converted and saved immeasurable beings. Now those in this great assembly, as well as I myself, have all seen them. You expound the principle of the true entity, open up the law of the single vehicle, broadly guiding the many beings, causing them quickly to attain Bodhi." Manjushri said, "When I was in the ocean, I constantly expounded the Lotus Sutra of the wonderful law alone." Bodhisattva Wisdom Accumulated questioned Manjushri, saying, "This sutra is very profound, subtle and wonderful, a treasure among sutras, a rarity in the world. Are there perhaps any living beings who, by earnestly and diligently practicing this sutra, have been able to attain Buddhahood quickly?" Manjushri replied, "There is the daughter of the Dragon King Sagara, who has just turned 8. Her wisdom has keen roots, and she is good at understanding the root activities and deeds of living beings. She has mastered the dharanis, has been able to accept and embrace all the storehouse of profound secrets preached by the Buddhas, has entered deep into meditation, thoroughly grasps the doctrines, and, in the space of an instant, conceived the desire for Bodhi and reached the level of no regression. Her eloquence knows no hindrance, and she thinks of living beings as though they were her own children. She is fully endowed with blessings, and when it comes to conceiving in mind and expounding by mouth, she is subtle, wonderful, comprehensive, and great. Kind, compassionate, benevolent, yielding, she is gentle and refined in will, capable of attaining Bodhi." Bodhisattva Wisdom Accumulated said, "When I observe Shakyamuni thus come one, I see that for immeasurable kalpas he carried out harsh and difficult practices, accumulating merit, piling up virtue, seeking the way of the bodhisattvas without ever resting. I observe that throughout the 1,000,000,000-fold world, there is not a single spot tiny as a mustard seed where this bodhisattva failed to sacrifice body and life for the sake of living beings. Only after he had done that was he able to complete the Bodhi way. I cannot believe that this girl, in the space of an instant, could actually achieve correct enlightenment." Before his words had come to an end, the Dragon King's daughter suddenly appeared before the Buddha, bowed her head in obeisance, and then retired to one side, reciting these verses of praise. He profoundly understands the signs of guilt and good fortune, and illuminates the 10 directions everywhere. His subtle, wonderful pure Dharma body is endowed with the 32 features. The 80 characteristics adorn his Dharma body. Heavenly and human beings gaze up in awe. Dragons and spirits all pay honor and respect. Among all living beings, none who do not hold him in reverence. And having heard his teachings, I have attained Bodhi. The Buddha alone can bear witness to this. I unfold the doctrines of the great vehicle to rescue living beings from suffering. At that time, Shariputra said to the dragon girl, "You suppose that in this short time you have been able to attain the unsurpassed way, but this is difficult to believe. Why? Because a woman's body is soiled and defiled, not a vessel for the law. How could you attain the unsurpassed Bodhi? The road to Buddhahood is long and far-stretching. Only after one has spent immeasurable kalpas pursuing austerities, accumulating deeds, practicing all kinds of paramitas, can one finally achieve success. Moreover, a woman is subject to the 5 obstacles. First, she cannot become a Brahma heavenly king. Second, she cannot become a king chakra. Third, she cannot become a devil king. Fourth, she cannot become a wheel-turning sage king. Fifth, she cannot become a Buddha. How then could a woman like you be able to attain Buddhahood so quickly?" At that time, the dragon girl had a precious jewel worth as much as the 1,000,000,000-fold world, which she presented to the Buddha. The Buddha immediately accepted it. The dragon girl said to the Bodhisattva wisdom accumulated, and to the venerable one Shariputra, "I presented the precious jewel, and the world-honored one accepted it. Was that not quickly done?" They replied, "Very quickly." The girl said, "Employ your supernatural powers and watch me attain Buddhahood. It will be even quicker than that." At that time, the members of the assembly all saw the dragon girl, in the space of an instant, change into a man and carry out all the practices of a bodhisattva, immediately proceeding to the spotless world of the south, taking a seat on a jeweled lotus, and attaining impartial and correct enlightenment. With the 32 features and the 80 characteristics, he expounded the wonderful law for all living beings everywhere in the 10 directions. At that time, in the Saha world, the bodhisattvas, voice-hearers, gods, dragons, and others of the 8 kinds of guardians, human and non-human beings, all from a distance, saw the dragon girl become a Buddha and preach the law to all the human and heavenly beings in the assembly at that time. Their hearts were filled with great joy, and all from a distance paid reverent obeisance. Immeasurable living beings, hearing the law, understood it and were able to reach the level of no regression. Immeasurable living beings received prophecies that they would gain the way. The spotless world quaked and trembled in 6 different ways. 3,000 living beings of the Saha world remained on the level of no regression. 3,000 living beings conceived a desire for Bodhi and received prophecies of enlightenment. Bodhisattva wisdom accumulated, Shariputra, and all other members of the assembly silently believed and accepted these things. So that was chapters 11 and 12 of the Lotus Sutra. Docs, any thoughts?
A lot of thoughts. So first, a couple of matters of keeping in mind what we're actually talking about. Some units of measure get brought up in the sutra segment that I think we should define so that we understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. So the words I notice are ashamkyas, yojana, nayuta, and kalpa. So an ashamka, according to what I looked up, is 10 to the 140th power. So 1 followed by 140 zeros. So again, ashamka is basically another way of saying huge number, and more or less the same thing with yojana and nayuta. Nayuta is 100 billion, and then a yojana is defined by approximately how far somebody can walk in a day. The article that I have up says between 3.5 and 15 kilometers. So when we're talking about thrones that are 50 yojana high, or whatever the actual sutra says, like, we're talking about a humongous thing. Like, we're talking about a throne that is miles high.
That's right. And same with asamkyas and with nayutas. These are just extraordinarily large numbers. And kalpa, as you probably saw, is a measure of time. It's several billion years.
So anytime that we're talking about numbers in this sutra, the purpose seems to be huge, be big.
And while it's true that all of these are extremely big and extremely extreme in all cases, the case remains that there still is like a measure of hierarchy, right? Some people's thrones are 40 yojanas in height, while others are a few hundred yojanas in height. Some people will become Buddhas in only a few medium-length kalpas, whereas some others will not become Buddhas until many immeasurable giant kalpas in the future. So even though these are all beyond human comprehension, there still is like an obvious hierarchy established by the text by these measures.
And another thing I want to talk to you that's kind of about the text as a whole rather than the contents of it. I know this is specific to the translation that we're looking at, but I noticed that this PDF has tremendous margins. Like, more than half of the page is blank on these because of the huge margins all around. I'm guessing that's intended to leave room for taking notes?
I'm honestly not sure. When it comes to scholarly translations like this one is, then a lot of times conventional choices, they just really go out the window. These conventional choices would include regular fonts, regular framing of the page, regular margins and stuff, and religious texts and scholarly stuff, they both kind of, in their own individual categories, reject those types of conventions, and together they especially reject those conventions. So there's some fun fonts, there's some wide, huge margins, which get even bigger whenever we get to the verse portion instead of just the prose portion. And yeah, it's really wasteful on paper. I have the paper copy of this book. It's Burton Watson's translation of the Lotus Sutra, and it is extraordinarily wasteful of paper. And usually these decisions are made by publishers and not by the authors or the translators themselves. So it's really hard to know who we can say, stop wasting trees to about this. But it's still a weird thing, but it makes it feel like you're reading it very quickly. It helped me whenever I had all of that space for note-taking, but I didn't use all of it for that, so no answers there.
So now, actually getting into the text. So I note at several points the word law is capitalized. So, for example, I'm looking fairly early into the first chapter, a law to instruct the bodhisattvas, guarded and kept in mind by the Buddhas, the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. Both times when I mentioned the word law there, that is capitalized. So I'm guessing that's Dharma?
That's right. Law is one of those many, many English translations of the word Dharma. And anytime that you see it in this text, I think just at all, you'll find that it's capitalized and that it refers to the Buddha Dharma.
So early on in this, I note that music is named as something that can be offered as alms. Meanwhile, there are rules stating that monks are not supposed to participate in music and performances. So what's going on there?
That's one of the million small ways out of also the million big ways that this text really goes against prior doctrine and prior rules for monks and nuns. In this case, offering music as alms doesn't really seem to make sense because they're not allowed to listen to music or to dance or anything like that. However, not only does the Mahayana reject a lot of those extra rules for monks and nuns, including being unable to handle money or something like that, it also kind of softens up some of these rules and changes how they might be expressed. So whenever they say offering music for alms, they're not talking about like offering up Panic at the Disco for alms. They're talking about specialized ritual music, which might be reflective of specific localized religious practice that's not necessarily Buddhist, or it might be reflective of maybe ringing bells. Bells are rung a lot at temple spaces for the purpose of not only marking time throughout the day, but also for establishing the start and the finish of a ritual or something like that. Percussion and music are also included for sort of getting the energy up for esoteric rituals, wherein a person might be possessed by the spirit or by the manifestation of a Buddha. And in this case, these sort of rituals explode in variety and in type and in form in the Mahayana, and they're not really as frequently seen in the Theravada. This is a quintessential and distinct Mahayana text, and so we're going to see a lot of stuff in it that goes against what we might have been learning prior in the Polycanon text that we've read.
All right. So let's start going into the text further. So with the emergence of the treasure tower, as part of this sutra, it looks like the Buddha is essentially like teleporting everybody away in order to make the area he's in a Pure Land. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, so the Buddha has the ability to just do that. That also happens in the Vimalakirti Sutra. We haven't read the chapters where it does happen yet, but the Buddha can just pick up his audience and send them over to Akshobhya's Pure Land in that particular text. Or in this one, he can send them out of his Pure Land for the purpose of making it more pure. He's sending out people who are non-Buddhists. He's sending out people who are afflicted by desire or by any other sort of unwholesome mind state. He's sending out animals and demons and hungry ghosts, and all that's left are the four kinds of believers, the Arhats, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and fully realized Buddhas. And in doing so, he's created a Pure Land that's a lot closer to Amida's Pure Land, which we've read about before. You'll note that in the Pure Land episodes that we've discussed, we've made a point to mention that Shakyamuni's Pure Land is not the most pure Pure Land out of all of them, because there's still suffering, there's still the word for suffering, there's still demons, hungry ghosts, and animals, and so on. However, in the context of this sutra, in this chapter, he just decides that that's not what he wants to do anymore. He just decides, okay, I'm going to make it like Amida's or other Buddha's Pure Lands, which are a lot more pure and which are level, as you've mentioned, and have the four kinds of believers only, and there's no word for suffering, and so on and so forth. And he does it for the purpose of teaching. He's kind of showing off his power, but he's also setting up the stage for what's to come, the emergence of the treasure tower.
So this text was rather difficult to read in this case, in part because of the repetition. At some point there was 2 paragraphs in a row mentioning 5 yojana tall lion seats. And like multiple times I found myself going, wait, which paragraph am I on? These paragraphs are almost the same. And it made it like previously it has not been as much of a problem for me to keep track of the repetition, but the sutra really made me go cross-eyed a couple of times, just going like, wait, which paragraph am I supposed to be on?
Yeah, and it does that because of the memory thing we've talked about, but also for visualization. So every time that there's repeated instances of these giant, huge numbers, then you're supposed to actually be trying to imagine the object that's being described. In this case, a lion's seat, which is just another name for like a throne that doesn't really have a back or arms. And you're supposed to be imagining one that's genuinely 5 yojanas high, right? So you said that it was in between 3 and 15 kilometers, right? So you're supposed to be imagining something that stretches nearly into the sky, and imagining a great realized bodhisattva sitting on top of it. And of course, they would be proportional, right? The bodhisattva or the believer of whoever kind, they're going to be the same size as the throne. And so you're building the scene in your head. Something that we didn't mention going into this is that by this point, everybody is floating up in the air over Vulture Peak. So one of the Buddha's favorite places to preach was this place called Rajagriha, or Vulture's Peak, which we've seen in other sutras. And for the purpose of the Lotus Sutra, and only in the Lotus Sutra as far as I know, the Buddha picks up his entire audience and picks up himself, and they are floating in the sky above Rajagriha. And because of that, a lot of imagery of the Lotus Sutra, especially in various sects of Japanese Buddhism, they will create artwork which kind of, I don't know, it kind of portrays that, but not in a realistic or a literal way. It kind of portrays that in a mandalic or kind of a symbolic way. And we've spoken about that kind of stuff in previous episodes on like Nichiren, so we don't need to go back into it. But just keep in mind that while all this is happening, there's people floating in the air, and their thrones are also floating in the air. So it's a really trippy scene.
At one point, I note that we are talking about a group of mountains. And so we have one mountain that is called Muchlinda,
Mhm.
and that does not get localized, whereas all of the other mountain names in this do. We have the Muchalinda Mountains, the Hamaha Muchalinda Mountains, Iron Encircling Mountains, Great Iron Encircling Mountains, and so on. And then Mount Sumeru at the end. So I guess this is another instance of what we've talked about localizing names being a problem before. So, like, we've got, from context, I understand that Maha means great. So we've got the Muchalinda Mountains and the Great Muchalinda Mountains, and those just don't have a translation, I guess, that works.
So the case with the Muchalinda issue is that Muchalinda is a name. Muchalinda is a great king of the Nagas, or the serpents. However, you bring up something very important, which is that whenever we meet Nagas in this, their names are not translated the same way that the Bodhisattvas are. So there's Bodhisattva wisdom accumulated, many treasures, Bodhisattva, but there's Muchalinda, and there's other Naga characters whose names are just used in their original language. And the only explanation I can come up with for that was that the translator chose to do that for the purpose of denoting that they were kind of a different species. The human beings, or I should say, the Bodhisattvas, the Buddhas, and the Pratyeka Buddhas and the Arhats, they get their names translated because their Dharma names are given to them after initiation, whereas Muchalinda and other Nagas, they're carrying their birth names. And so that might explain why we see their names in the original, whereas the Bodhisattva wisdom accumulated and the many treasures Buddha, they have these translated names because those names are not their birth names.
So at one point, the sutra states that preaching the Lotus Sutra is difficult indeed. I'm not clear on what's supposed to be going here. Like, the sutra is written down for us. It's here. What exactly is supposed to be difficult here? Is it a matter of, like, a hidden meaning of the sutra? Is it a matter of practicing what it preaches as well? Like, what is difficult about preaching this?
So the reason why they are saying that preaching the sutra after the Buddha is dead, or in all of these different circumstances that are presented at the end of the chapter 11, is because in the absence of a Buddha from whom you can hear this sutra, all you have to go on is your memory of it. And as you've seen, it's an extraordinarily long sutra. It's 28 chapters, and in English, in translation, it's over 300 pages. So if you're even able to recite a page or a passage of it from memory perfectly, then you're already doing a great job, especially in the event that there's no Buddha in your world to help you out. So this is one of those portions of a Mahayana text which is extraordinarily concerned with how to practice Buddhism properly in the absence of a living Buddha. Once ours, Shakyamuni, once he died, we had to start doing this on our own. We had to start figuring out what to do and how to do it without a teacher. And that being the case, this text is saying, as long as you remember the words of this sutra and speak them and preach them and do the 5 actions with them, then you'll be good. You'll be okay. That would actually be quite a difficult thing to do and quite an achievement if you were able to do it. And so it's also dealing with what someone ought to do with the sutra in the absence of a living Buddha to preach to them.
So the difficulty is a matter of magnitude and a matter of precision in this. So, like, what I guess I should have been thinking about this in the terms of the entire sutra, whereas right now we're reading 2 relatively short chapters of it.
Yeah, and it's also just unclear what the actual Lotus Sutra is. This text refers to itself more than any other Mahayana texts, and there are times where the text says, okay, the Buddha is getting ready to preach the Lotus Sutra, and there's times where it says the Buddha is preaching the Lotus Sutra, and there's times where it says the Buddha had preached the Lotus Sutra, and we don't really get a clear start or finish to that Lotus Sutra. In chapter 1, he preaches an entirely different sutra. And then in chapter 2, he explains skillful means. And then 3 through 7 are parables about the Dharma and the one vehicle. And it just keeps going and going and going. And you never really know what is actually the Lotus Sutra. And for that reason, there's been a lot of disagreement about not only what the Lotus Sutra is, but what the central teaching of it is, right? You can interpret this as being the book in front of us from start to finish. But as I've explained in the introductions and discussions of our Lotus Sutra reading episodes, the Lotus Sutra was composed in the form that we see it today in 4 temporally very distant periods. There was the period of the verse portions of chapter 2 through 9, and then there was the prose, and then later there was the second half, and then later there was chapters in the sutra that are other sutras unto themselves, and then there was the Devadatta chapter, which is chapter 12, which we'll discuss later. So this sutra is really piecemeal, and knowing where it starts or finishes is really difficult.
So there's just a lot going on here. So let's get to the elephant in the room that we've kind of been dancing around a little bit. So the Treasure Tower chapter overturns a previous Buddha's parinibbana entirely in order to hear the Lotus Sutra be preached. So this is a Buddha, I forgot his name.
His name is Many Treasures, or in Sanskrit, I have him in Sanskrit, Prabhuta Ratna.
Prabhuta Ratna, Many Treasures. I'm going to continue saying Many Treasures just to keep with what the translation we're working with says.
Sure.
So Many Treasures is a Buddha from the past that has altered or set up his parinibbana in order to reappear every time the Lotus Sutra gets preached.
That's right.
So that's a big deal. We've talked before that the root word of nirvana means extinguish, right? Snuffed out. Like nirvana and parinibbana are supposed to be like you're done. Like it's over sort of thing. And now we've got this sutra contradicting that. That is a big deal.
It's a massive deal. So the idea before, like you say, was that whenever somebody has fully exited samsara, fully exited the cycle of birth and death, they don't come back. They die one last time. Even the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, when he's born, he declares as soon as he's born and he walks out of the side of his mother's body, he says, "This is my final rebirth. I'm not coming back anymore." And so up to that point, in all of the texts, in all of Buddhism, and I can say this, meaning, of course, all of the texts that we have and that are extant and that are used and that we have translations of and so on and so forth, all of the texts, as we know them, say that nirvana is it. Once you're there, you've won the game. It's over. You're done. And in this case, somehow, this Buddha, Many Treasures Buddha, has made these vows that he comes back. And what's crazy about this is that nirvana is supposed to happen without remainder. So you're not supposed to have a body or a spirit or a consciousness or an aggregate or anything left. You're not supposed to have any capability of coming back to samsara because you have no connection to it. You have no physical, karmic, or any other kind of connection to it. And still, however, he has yoked himself to the Lotus Sutra, and he reappears, interestingly, as a skeleton in a reliquary tower, and he hears the sutra preached. Now, this is another case where I think that Mahayana Buddhism is concerned with how to relate with the Buddha even after he's died. You'll notice that the reliquary tower that he arrives in, the jeweled stupa, the treasure tower, it is named all 3 of these things, it's holding his physical remains, which still have some special power in this phenomenal world. And whenever he comes out and is involved with the Buddha during this chapter, it's actually his relics, his bones, his remains, after he's been cremated, after he's followed the proper death rites. And so this is taking for granted that the relics or the remains of past Buddhas, which are enshrined in stupas, are actually that Buddha themselves. But that would make no sense if they've made perfect nirvana. So basically, it's quietly asserting that perinirvana is actually not the end. It's not it. It's not over after that. And that sets us up for a doctrine that's going to come in a later chapter that we're going to read and discuss. I believe it's chapter 16. But the argument is essentially that the Buddha Shakyamuni has been alive for immeasurable eons, immeasurable kalpas, and he's already reached his perinirvana several times, and that he's still alive, and that he's is a primordial Buddha who's been here since, quote unquote, the beginning. And this really, really gets close to violating the law of impermanence.
I'm not even sure I would say it's close to. I think it is violating the law of impermanence. Because my understanding is, like from previous discussions, the idea is that the next Buddha is going to live the same life as Shakyamuni did. And so that means that this sutra would be preached over and over again, and therefore many treasures is going to come back over and over again. Like, there's no end to that other than the end of samsara in general, and I don't know that that's really a possibility in this setup. Like, as much as impermanence is a big deal, it also feels like there is no outlet for this permanent cycle other than the complete end of samsara.
Yeah, there is no end for any of this. And in the doctrine that the Buddha has an immeasurable lifespan, or that he's a primordial Buddha of which all others are manifestations, or in this idea that many treasures Buddha comes back every time the Lotus Sutra is preached, all of that is really starting to mess up the system that samsara is sort of set up with. And it gets even more complicated when you think about the fact that in other realms other than this one, the Lotus Sutra is being preached at the same time as it's being preached in this one. So in Amida's Pure Land, for example, he's preaching the Dharma the entire time that he's there, and so he's going to preach the Lotus Sutra to those people. Interestingly, he's going to have to do so without ever saying the word suffering, which is going to be difficult, I think. But Many Treasures Buddha shows up there, too, at the same time that he's showing up to Shakyamuni. And so it's really, how can he be in so many places at once, and how can he come back? The only answer that I can really come up with that makes it all make sense is that we have to take an enlightened perspective. That's kind of always the answer that we have to do with these sort of texts. Anytime it seems to contradict itself, or to contradict our phenomenal reality, or contradict a former doctrine, we just have to say to ourselves both non-duality and also Buddhas can do anything and everything. And also, if you look at it from an enlightened perspective, it doesn't break any rules at all. This is the doctrine of, it's actually got a name, it's the doctrine of non-obstruction, where essentially two things can be true in the Dharma at the same time, and they can also contradict each other. And both are true and neither are true, if that makes sense. This is the kind of thing that helps different sects reconcile different doctrines with each other, and it also helps them reconcile, like, between sects and among sects, and it also is just another way to look at Theravada and Mahayana and still say non-duality and be able to get somewhere, instead of saying they're right or I'm right and they're wrong.
Anything else you think we should talk about that chapter before we move on to chapter 12?
Let me see. Oh yeah, so this chapter is one of the places where the Lotus Sutra says that it is the foremost king of all other sutras. Other Mahayana sutras say that they are superior in a lot of ways, or superior to other teachings, but the Lotus Sutra says that it's even better than those specific Mahayana sutras. You'll see throughout this text, in these chapters, that they keep saying this thing about a one vehicle, and just like from the parable of the burning house, this keeps referring to the Buddha vehicle. It's the one vehicle because it encompasses all the other three. It encompasses the Bodhisattva vehicle, the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, and the Arhat vehicle. And the reason it's the largest is, of course, because it saves the most sentient beings. And so this is sort of repeating some of that, and also kind of hyping itself up and anticipating critiques to itself. whenever we think about the actual history about how the Lotus Sutra was received in different regions of Asia, this is something important we refer to. If you get a huge, just like tractor trailer full of texts, and you start sorting through them, and only one of them says it's the most superior text of all, it doesn't say it's more superior than the Hinayana texts. It doesn't say it's more superior than the non-Buddhist texts. It says it's more superior than the Mahayana, than the Hinayana, than the non-Buddhist texts. Then you start to understand why people looked at this and they were like, okay, this is the one. I'm going to put this at the front and study all the other ones to a lesser degree, or emphasize the doctrines in all the other ones only in the context of this one. So this one really determines the interpretations of a lot of doctrine in Buddhism, especially as it migrates through China, Korea, and Japan, simply because it self-proclaims to be the king of all sutras.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how to approach that, because on the one hand, there was a person who wrote that into the sutra at some point. Like, a person did that, set themselves up for that. But also, this is a text that's a really big religious deal, and, like, people have gotten... I'm not sure I'm going to want to keep this little sidetrack now that I'm speaking about it, because there's no way to say this without being judgmental about it. And, like, it's kind of uncool to do with a text that so many people are religiously devoted to.
I think you can approach it from the fact that this is a very controversial text, because even though this text does say that it's the king of all sutras, not everybody believes it. Some people regard it as apocryphal because it violates the doctrine of impermanence, for example, or it also will go back and say that other sutras are not as important or as good, or it'll emphasize very sectarian bodhisattvas or something like that. And so you can definitely approach it from the fact that, like, it's a hot topic, if nothing else, right? It's important to a lot of people, but also a lot of other people really dislike it or just completely disregard it entirely.
So that kind of links us into going into the next chapter, the Devadatta chapter. So first of all, overall, this feels like two different texts that got slammed together at some point. How there's this relatively short opening section talking about Devadatta and his previous life with Shakyamuni as a Sita and a unnamed great king. So we have that as well. But then the second half of this chapter is about the dragon girl who reaches enlightenment almost just to spite Sariputra.
Yeah, that's right. You're right on both counts. This is a completely separate text that we know for a fact was authored at a separate time by a separate group of individuals in the fourth and final period of the composition of the sutra. So this would have happened, as I mentioned in the intro at the very, very top of the reading in the episode, it would have happened in the 1st or 2nd century CE, when the order of the text was starting to kind of cement. And yeah, the chapter is named after Devadatta because he's like a very well-known character. And as you're picking up on, the message is that it can spite the other earlier texts, right? So in this case, the Dragon Girl and Devadatta and all of these radical individuals that are at the fringes of Buddhist morality and at the fringes of like the possibility of Buddhahood, they start getting prophecies or they start attaining Buddhahood in front of people's very eyes, just to push to the logical limits the doctrine of universal Buddhahood contingent upon attachment to the Lotus Sutra.
So in the first half of this, we have the Buddha as a great king who desperately wants to hear the Lotus Sutra, and a previous incarnation of Devadatta named Asita comes in to teach that Lotus Sutra and essentially enslaves the great king in exchange for the Lotus Sutra. So we're kind of seeing that even in previous lifespans, Devadatta is one of the bad guys in these. Like, even if he's preaching the Lotus Sutra, he's also enslaving somebody with that sutra. Like, he's weaponizing it in that way. And yet the text talks about that as an overall meritorious act, entirely contingent on how superior the Lotus Sutra is.
That's right. Yeah. And, this text is famous for not only really turning up its nose at conventional Buddhist morality in very obvious ways, like Devadatta will eventually become a Buddha, but it also does so in not so obvious ways throughout this theme of skillful means that we've been seeing since the very beginning. So I think there are a couple of layers to the skillful means doctrine as it can be seen in this chapter, especially in this story with Devadatta and with Shakyamuni. So this is meant to mirror the early life of Shakyamuni, where he was a person of great power, and he renounced all of that power and yoked himself to the path of enlightenment. And the same exact thing happens here. He is a king in a previous life, and he renounces all of that just so that he can be preached the Lotus Sutra and yoke himself to that. So through this parable, you might call it, the Buddha is demonstrating that the Lotus Sutra is even superior to the path of enlightenment that he yoked himself to earlier in his life. So this is the Lotus Sutra addressing the older, what is now Theravada doctrine, and is saying this is far superior to that. Another layer of the skillful means is the extremity of the king's situation, his willingness to become enslaved, and Asita's willingness to enslave him, and the slavery part of it altogether, I think is embellished, or maybe allegorical would be a better word, for how important and how big of a deal this text is. The Buddha is saying to his audience, this is such a big deal, you should be willing to become a slave for it. Now, it's an open debate whether this is saying that will happen or not, if that makes sense. So figuratively, you should be willing to enslave yourself for it, but I don't know if it means that anybody's actually going to be enslaved for it in real life. If that happened in real life, that would be really messed up. But at the same time, this text seems to want you to think that that's kind of what it's suggesting. So skillful means makes these things really complicated. It makes it complicated to know if something actually happened or not, and it makes it complicated to know if something should or should not happen from a moral standpoint.
So, in this chapter, the Buddha says that Devadatta is eventually going to reach his enlightenment, but it's not at all described how he's going to do that. So, what's going on there? Like, what else is there to know with that?
Yeah, so in previous chapters, when the Buddha starts giving off prophecies of future Buddhahood, the formula that he uses earlier in the text is that if you yoke yourself to the Lotus Sutra and you do the 5 practices of the Lotus Sutra, these are to expound it, protect it, embrace it, so on and so forth. If you do that, then you will eventually reach Buddhahood. So the text creates a circular reasoning for itself. If you attach yourself to the Lotus Sutra, then you'll become a Buddha. And if you don't attach yourself to the Lotus Sutra, then you won't become a Buddha, because the Lotus Sutra teaching itself that we're referring to is that if you attach yourself to the Lotus Sutra, you'll become a Buddha. And if you don't, then you won't. And so on and so forth in circles for eons. So this is one of those cases where it kind of closes the circle in how do these people attain Buddhahood. However, at the same time, because of the universality of the doctrine and the way that the doctrine is presented and packaged in the sutra, claiming itself to be the king of all doctrines, the king of all texts, you seem to think at the end of it that this means that everybody, and I mean everybody, every single sentient being, from demons all the way up to gods, will eventually in some time become a Buddha. And that can be complicated to think about. It makes you start to think about like the true end of samsara, the true trajectory of the cosmos as we know it. Is there eventually going to be a time where the very last sentient being exits samsara? Well, the text says no, because when you exit samsara, you can come back, like many treasures Buddha. And it says also that if you are fully enlightened, then you can come back and present yourself as not being fully enlightened. We've talked about this with hidden Buddhas and hidden Bodhisattvas before. So even if you have been preached the Lotus Sutra, and whether or not you remember it, and whether or not you've reached full Buddhahood as a result of it, you can still mess around in samsara. And as a result of that, the morality in the Lotus Sutra is complicated again, because not only is everyone's behavior a skillful means, possibly, but also you don't know if you're dealing with a hidden Buddha or a hidden Bodhisattva, and you don't know what to do about that. You don't know if you should listen to their actions or not. You don't know if you should doubt them or not. You don't know how deferent and how reverent you should be to them, because they could be a demon in disguise or they could be a bodhisattva in disguise. And so it's a really confusing situation that the sutra puts the reader in.
And so the ultimate answer for Devadatta's enlightenment becomes the Lotus Sutra, then.
Right.
And that's a matter of faith rather than scholarly debate. I think there's not much that we can really debate about that here. Either you believe the Lotus Sutra or you don't.
Exactly right. And that's just kind of how the case is with a lot of Mahayana texts, because there's a transition around the same time that Mahayana texts start to be authored, but a little bit after, where they start to really realize or start to really deal with this issue of like, can this happen if I just don't believe that it will happen? We've talked a lot on this show about how the world as it exists before our eyes in our phenomenal sensory reality exists in that way, according to some doctrines, as a result of our consciousness. If our consciousness is predominantly good, then our reality is predominantly good, and the opposite is true.
Which is, I suspect, why in the previous chapter, the Buddha has to teleport everybody away.
Exactly.
So that sets things up such that only people who are able to have whatever changed one's consciousness needed to be in a Pure Land, those folks who haven't done that go away in order to make this possible.
Exactly. And so the response to this Lotus Sutra and to other Mahayana texts by people who believe in that mind-only doctrine is to say, if I just don't believe it, then it doesn't happen. If I don't accept that, if I don't let that leave karmic roots or karmic seeds in me, then it just simply will not be true. It will not be the case. And of course, they also reject it on the grounds of the impermanence and other stuff we've talked about already. And so Mahayana has a unique need doctrinally, textually, to enforce itself against that sort of critique, against that sort of argument. And the way that it does so is through this discussion of faith. Faith is kind of the unquantifiable small d dharma, which allows crazy things to be true and not true at the same time. It kind of enforces an argument outside of the mind-only doctrine. There's a whole text on this that we will eventually read and discuss called The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, and it deals exactly with this whole thing. What is the role of faith in Mahayana Buddhism specifically? How do we define and understand faith in Buddhism as opposed to, this is me reading this into the text. It doesn't say this in the text, but how do we define faith differently than we would in Christianity and in other religions? And how does this actually make sense with other doctrines in Buddhism?
So then we get to the second half of this chapter of the sutra. So like we said before, this looks like a pair of different texts that got combined together. So we get to a point where Sariputra is doubting the enlightenment of a dragon girl on the point that she's a girl, she's a child, and she's not human. So Sariputra puts forth those three reasons that she can't be enlightened, and basically responds to all of this by removing all three of those disqualifiers that Sariputra has and just becomes a male bodhisattva right there in front of him. So at that point, it seems like there's 2 points trying to be made here. For one, Sariputra is wrong always, forever. as with other Mahayana sutras, and also the fact that in reality, enlightenment can be a very quick and sudden thing.
That's exactly right. So Shariputra cites those three that you mentioned, but in particular, he's stuck on the gender issue. This is something that happens to him in the Vimalakirti Sutra as well. He gets stuck on gender issues a lot. And it's weird because we've talked about how Ananda wanted to implement the possibility of Buddhist nuns in the community, and Shariputra was not one of his critics on that, actually. That was Mahakashapa who was a critic of that. So it's weird that Shariputra in the sutras is the one who gets stuck on gender issues. In the Mahayana sutras gets stuck on gender issues, but Mahakashapa gets stuck on them in other situations. However, all of that aside, in this case, Shariputra cites that women are defiled and soiled. This is because they have menstruation, and so that means that their bodies are impure, according to him, and they're subject to the 5 obstacles. The 5 obstacles are not mentioned in any other sutra but the Lotus Sutra, as far as I know. I cannot for the life of me find these 5 obstacles in any other text that we have available to us ever. And these 5 obstacles are not really obstacles like being a woman or a child or a non-human. They're more like states of being or just diagnoses of the reality of being a woman. And they are: a woman cannot become a Brahma, a Chakra, a Devil King, a Wheel-Turning King, or a Buddha. And I should note that outside of the Lotus Sutra, in Hindu Brahmanical society at the time, these 5 are often paired with the 3 obediences, which they're not Buddhist, but just for context, they are that a woman ought to obey her father in youth, her husband in adulthood, and her sons in old age. And so this dragon girl comes along, and the reason why she is so special in this story is because she is subject to those 5 obstacles that we mentioned before, but also the 3 problems of being a child, being a non-human, and being a woman. And in the amount of time that it takes her to offer a jewel to the Buddha, she transforms into a man and becomes a fully realized Buddha. So it's weird because the text seems to argue that, yes, a woman can do it, yes, a child can do it, yes, a non-human can do it, but they have to become a man first. So is it really an open avenue for women to achieve Buddhahood in a way that they had not before? Or is it really just reinforcing the older doctrine that, no, they can't, they have to become a man first? Now, this dragon girl had been working on the Dharma, working on the Lotus Sutra, working on all of this other stuff for millions, trillions of lifetimes prior to this scene where we see this. So we're really seeing like the very tip-top pinnacle moment of all of her karma all at once. Even still, she had to turn into a man first. It really sucks. It really sucks because, you know, this was every opportunity for the sutra to go off and say, actually, women can be Buddhas too. Especially if it's trying to push this message, which I think it is, that even the most evil people, even non-humans, even children, even women can become Buddhas. It still doesn't go so far to say women can become Buddhas. It makes me think, actually, that according to this text, women, just as they are worse off than Devadatta, the most evil character in all of Buddhism.
Yeah, it's a matter of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. This feels like an author trying and failing, rather than an author being malicious from the start. I get the impression whoever wrote this was trying to be progressive.
I can buy that. And even if we don't know specifically who the authors were, we know that they were men. They were monks in either an urban or a solitary forest setting, and they had an agenda against other monks who were also men. They didn't really have an agenda against women, against nuns specifically, as far as scholars have argued through the text. And so the mind of the authors themselves might have been to be more progressive than other sutras, and we can see that it kind of is. It does provide a pathway for instant Buddhahood for women, children, non-humans. However, at the same time, the sutra is so quick to completely upturn what was at this point 7 centuries of doctrine, I just can't see why it would not be as able, equally energetic in upturning 7 centuries of Buddhist gender doctrine. It's odd, right? They have expertly executed an upturning of peri-nirvana. They've expertly upturned the entire doctrine of impermanence. But here, even if all those things can be turned on their heads, women still have to turn into men before they can become Buddhas. It's outstanding part of the chapter. And when I say outstanding, of course, I mean it's a part that sticks out to scholars and sticks out to practitioners, because even in the Lotus Sutra, which is like the weirdest of the weird texts in the best way of Mahayana texts, this is the weirdest part of it. It gets right up to the finish line and it doesn't cross it here, whereas there is no finish line in all other contexts. They've already crossed it before they've even started writing, so it's odd.
So that covers what all we wanted to talk about on the sutra. If viewers have questions that I didn't ask, please get in contact with us. And yeah, I think we're good here. So thank you for listening to our discussion of chapters 11 and 12 of the Lotus Sutra.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.